Thank you all for making time today and really looking forward to this presentation. So I'll go ahead and start with introducing our speakers and then allow them to introduce more about the specifics of the upcoming presentation. So let me start here with Dr. Saxbe, who's on the screen. She is a professor and director of clinical training for the clinical science program within the University of Southern California's Department of Psychology. Her current work focuses on the transition to parenthood and follows couples from pregnancy into the first year postpartum. A related study examines the fathering brain using neuroimaging to scan fathers both prenatally and at postpartum. She has studied the transformative impact of new parenthood on the brain, body, mind, as well as the enduring legacy of early family environments on child well-being. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and she received a Fulbright Fellowship to study the parenting brain in Spain in the fall of 2019. And then I'll introduce our other speaker as well. Gabriel León is a fourth-year PhD student in clinical psychology at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on understanding the formation, maintenance, and repair of close relationships within families. Gabriel is also interested in understanding the impact of chronic and acute stress on parental mental health and well-being. His research has been funded by the National Academy of Sciences and the NIH, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. In his clinical work, Gabriel works primarily with foster and adoptive families and formerly incarcerated parents who are in the process of reconnecting with their children. Gabriel was born and raised in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and hopes to eventually return to New Mexico to serve the community as a clinical scientist, educator, and mentor, which is so exciting for us. Okay, well, thank you both for joining us. I'll go ahead and hand over to you for the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share the slides. Let me hopefully do this correctly. Okay. Can everybody see the slideshow okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I'll get right into it. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. I don't need to repeat myself too much, but I studied the transition to parenthood and I'm at the University of Southern California. Gabe, do you want to say just a couple quick words about yourself too?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Christina. I'm one of Darby's graduate students in the NEST lab, a fourth year. My research focuses primarily on family dynamics and parental mental health and well-being. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, when I got this invitation to do this colloquium and I saw that it was in New Mexico, of course, my first thought was I have to somehow get Gabe to show up for this too, because he is a proud New Mexican and I know was excited to interact with folks today. So just to kind of start us off, I want to set a framework of how to think about the transition to parenthood, or at least how I think about the transition to parenthood. I think when it comes to early parenthood, we're sort of often focused on, importantly, the development of an infant or child, because that's a really dynamic, critical window of early development. We don't often think about the development of parents, but I would argue there is also a lot of change, remodeling, plasticity, opportunity, risk, and vulnerability that takes place during this time period. And we know from both animal models and from an emerging literature on humans that we see neurobiological remodeling. So we see changes to hormones, we see changes to the brain. My work looks at that in fathers as well as in mothers. We also see psychosocial changes, like changes to relationship dynamics, which Gabe will talk a little bit about, changes to identity, sense of self. Behavioral changes, like changes to our sleep routines, right? Our eating and our exercise. And in turn, I think we see inflected risk across different domains of health vulnerability, from thinking about stress and coping and wear and tear, inflammation and allostatic load, weight change and obesity risk, mood disorders, which we know have elevated prevalence in the perinatal period. So I think a lot of our research focuses on cardiometabolic risk factor in late life, but I would argue we can shift our time window a little earlier and detect some really interesting trajectories of risk that emerge during the transition to parenthood. And I want to specifically highlight fathers because I think they're understudied, but important contributors to child rearing and undergoing transformation of their own. This is a clip I like to show from the movie Paddington. This is the couple heading to the hospital for the birth of their first child. So you can see they're on their motorcycle. Let me see if I can play this clip.
Darby, I'm not sure if we have sound.
Oh, maybe I didn't share with sound. Can everybody hear my sound, but you just can't hear the sound of the... Okay, it's actually it's just music, so you're not missing much excitement in terms of sound. But I'll just narrate. So the couple has gone to the hospital on the motorcycle. The baby's now been born, they're coming out, and the father says, be careful with the pollen, there's a baby here. He's holding the car seat. They've changed the bike into a sensible sedan. He's wearing a 3-piece suit. So it's an exaggerated depiction of how our priorities change when we become parents. But I think many new parents relate to that sense of, they go almost overnight from wild and crazy individual to person whose goals are much more around keeping the family safe. And fathers are, and the quote, which you didn't hear at the end of the little clip, is the narrator saying, becoming a father does strange things to a man. And indeed, fathers are strange in the sense that human fathers who are involved in parenting are relatively unusual examples of paternal care in the world of animals and different species. So in the majority of species, about 95% of species, males do not contribute to parental care. There are some really interesting exceptions. Fish are actually very involved in fatherhood. So if you've seen the movie Finding Nemo, the father fish is chasing his son across the ocean. In fact, clownfish, of which Nemo is one, are in charge of guarding the stash of eggs and keeping them fresh, aerating the water. Birds are also very involved in biparental care and provisioning of offspring. Many birds are partnered, like as in they form enduring partnerships. But mammalian fathers are particularly rare. And so the fact that human males participate in parenthood, and of course not all human males do, but certainly many elect to do so, makes us as humans an unusual species. And I would argue it's one secret to our success as a species, right? Our babies are born fundamentally unfinished. Unlike a giraffe who can get up and walk within a few hours of birth, our babies require intensive care for much of the first year of life and beyond. They can't communicate, they can't ambulate, they can't feed on their own. And because we require such intensive care, we need a lot of help on the ground to aid us in caregiving. And because we work together across communities, we need everybody, all hands on deck, to contribute to the project of child rearing. So fathers are one example of that alloparenting team that I think makes our species resilient and adaptable. And what we know from many mammals who lose a mother early in life is that survival rates are very low. That's not the case in humans, right? Because we do have that tag team of caregivers who can often step in, and that makes us able to live in different kinds of territories and under different kinds of circumstances. The other interesting thing about fathers is just the sort of huge range in their parenting involvement. And there's a range historically, there's a range culturally. There are, many fathers we can think of, contemporary fathers who are primary caregivers, sole caregivers of a child. There are fathers who've never met their child. And if you look at sort of different models in our evolutionary history, this picture shows the Aka hunter-gatherers. They are a society that has sort of the highest documented rates of father involvement. Men are within arm's reach of babies about 50% of the time when they're awake. And fathers are frequently seen holding babies, participating in care. The other picture is of a father in Finland, which is the only country in which fathers of school-age children spend more time with kids per day than mothers do. So there's some examples of fathers who are really sort of leading in infant care, and then there are a lot of examples of fathers who are less involved. And I think studying that variability is really interesting when we apply a neurobiological framework. So, what are the correlates of greater father involvement for the body and for the brain? So I'm going to tell you about a couple of testosterone studies that I've done. I think looking at testosterone is an interesting example of a hormone that tracks with fatherhood involvement. We know that, first of all, testosterone is associated with secondary sex characteristics in men. There are detectable testosterone levels in women, but they tend to be many times lower. And testosterone appears to facilitate mating or competition for mates, status seeking, power, and dominance. We also know that in biparental mammals, including humans, we see drops in testosterone across the transition to fatherhood, and that those drops appear to be adaptive. They're associated with reduced aggression towards infants. So in humans, there are a number of studies, including some longitudinal studies, that find lower testosterone among partnered fathers or men who become fathers compared to non-fathers. And those decreases are involved in investment and hands-on care. So I looked at I've worked on a few different studies of testosterone across the transition to parenthood, finding that fathers do indeed show declining testosterone levels across pregnancy and parenthood, but also that fathers can entrain with their partners and show synchrony in hormone levels across the transition to parenthood in ways that might set up their relationship investment as measured postpartum. I've also looked at testosterone in a mental health context. So we talk a lot about postpartum depression, perinatal depression in women. There is also increased prevalence of mood disorders in new fathers. They have about twice the rate of mental health problems in the first year after birth than men in the general population. And there has been really little exploration of hormonal mechanisms for that. There has been some arguments made that low testosterone might be a risk factor for depression. Testosterone tends to decline across the lifespan. Depression rates are higher in older men. And supplementing testosterone has been suggested as a treatment for men who are depressed. So I was very curious to look at depression and testosterone in new parents. In one study, I found that men who had lower postpartum testosterone were in fact more likely to report depressive symptoms. But an interesting, surprising kind of twist to that was that the partners of those men actually reported higher depression when their fathers had, or when their partners had higher testosterone. So there was sort of an opposite effect of testosterone on depressive symptoms for both fathers and mothers. And the result for mothers' depression was explained by their relationship quality. And women whose partners had higher testosterone in the postpartum period also reported more intimate partner aggression, and more fathers in that study reported more parenting stress at 15 months postpartum. So I think this study tells us that the role of testosterone in the family around the transition to parenthood is complex, and that supplementation of men's testosterone might have unintended consequences for the partner and for the infant. And I think that's a relevant thing for us to be thinking about, because many more men are presenting to primary care physicians interested in testosterone supplementation. There's a big sort of online culture around taking testosterone for, muscle health and other reasons. But it looks like we really do need to consider it in the context of interpersonal relations. So I'm going to shift gears a little and have Gabe present a few slides specifically about interpersonal relationships in new parent couples. And this work draws from data that we've collected in our lab here at USC. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Darby. That was a good transition. As was mentioned in my introduction earlier, what really drew me to Darby's lab was her focus on what I call interpersonal dynamics or family dynamics, which is just a fancy way of saying are speaking about the patterns of behavior, emotion, and even physiological covariation that we see within close relationships. So that could be within couples, it could be within parents and children. And my research is focused on how do we use the different tools of research to map those dynamics and then see if those dynamics are predictive of health and well-being across various indicators, both biological and psychological as well. Another way of stating that, or an example being, is how do couples cope with stress, right? How do couples influence one another's emotions whenever there's something stressful that happens at work, stressful life event, etc. So that was work that I did a lot during my master's program. And coming into Darby's lab, I wanted to understand that within the context of the transition to parenthood. So a term that gets thrown around a lot in this field is emotional co-regulation, which we're just referring specifically to that process by which couples help to regulate or co-regulate one another's emotions. So it could be in a positive direction, so helping your partner to feel more positive feelings, or it could be with trying to down-regulate negative emotions, right? Both of those could be adaptive. Now, what we really don't understand, though, is what are the active ingredients of co-regulation, right? We may know it colloquially, but actually the research base in what specific kinds of behaviors help to co-regulate emotions, that is a little bit scant. So one of the benefits of the data we've collected in our laboratories, we have a lot of dyadic discussion paradigms. So we have expectant parents come into the laboratory, and we have them discuss various different topics. And one of those topics was areas of conflict in their relationship. So what we had them do was we had them fill out a questionnaire where they picked different subjects. So it could be finances, it could be their sex life, it could be time on their phone. And we had them identify areas that they wanted to change. And where there was overlap, we asked them to talk about it for 15 minutes. These videotapes were observationally coded and transcribed by research assistants using a specific kind of coding system that looks for particular behaviors that we're interested in. And one of the behaviors that I was interested in was validation, or showing a sincere understanding or acknowledgement of what the other partner is communicating. And I wanted to see if that actually facilitates a drop in negative emotion. So Darby, you can go to the next slide. And I won't get into the modeling that I used, but I used a kind of dynamic, like state space modeling technique. And I was able to actually identify whenever partners validate the other's negative emotion, it actually leads to a pretty reliable drop in that partner's negative emotion that isn't explained by other different kinds of behaviors. It's unique to validation, and it went both ways. So it went with women validating men and vice versa. And these were different gender dyads only for this study. So that was pretty interesting. But then, okay, well, what does that actually mean? Does that actually predict things that we care about? That was the next question. You can go ahead to the next slide, Darby. The first thing I wanted to look at, the low-hanging fruit, was, does it actually predict partners' relationship quality? And we find that it actually does. So for women in particular, women who validated more often, they reported higher relationship quality during pregnancy and during the postpartum period. So it seems to hang together with women's relationship satisfaction. Even more interesting, though, is the partners who received validation, both men and women, those who received more validation reported higher relationship quality 6 months later, at 6 months postpartum, because the interaction was measured during pregnancy. So it's predictive of postpartum relationship quality. So that's something that a big piece of this study was, can we understand interpersonal dynamics during pregnancy, and does it predict postpartum outcomes? And it didn't stop here either. We also found, you can go to the next slide, Darby. We also found that validation predicted various indicators of family well-being. So we found that men who validated their partner more often reported less parenting stress, and women who validated their partner more often reported less parent-infant bonding issues at 6 months postpartum. So I thought this was a really stellar study demonstrating a particular mechanism of co-regulation, which is validation or communicating sincere understanding. And it demonstrated that behavior actually is predictive of indicators of family well-being. So I'd love to continue this research, looking more at different biobehavioral correlates of these kinds of behaviors like validation. And with that, I'll pass it back to Darby to talk a little bit more about, I believe, our neuro research.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe. Yeah, I think this work really underscores the importance of looking at couple level processes and including fathers when we study the transition to parenthood. So much our focus is solely on the mother, which of course is very important. And The mother often has, many concerns that need to be addressed. But when we understand the family system, I think we understand more about, how to help families in transition. So yeah, I'm going to shift gears to talk a bit about some of our neuroimaging research. And the work I'm going to tell you about is drawn from the same study sample that Gabe just described. So we brought first-time expectant parents into the lab in mid to late pregnancy. We had them undergo the discussion tasks that Gabe just shared data from, as well as respond to questionnaires and let us take their testosterone measures along with other hormones. And then we scanned the men's brains. So we were really curious to see whether we could pick up on any structural or functional change to the brain accompanying first-time parenthood. And just to kind of introduce this topic, and I mentioned early on that I think of the transition to parenthood as a critical window for plasticity. We know that our brain and body are shaped by our experiences, right? The brain is not inert. It's not sort of preset. It is, it is remodeled by the experiences that we have across our lives. And we also know that they're enhanced windows of plasticity that seem to be characterized by particularly profound change. Certainly in early childhood, when many new connections are being formed and a lot of early learning happens, but also in adolescence. And there's been this new literature on adolescent brain in the last 20 years or so that has really shown how different parts of the brain seem to mature earlier than other parts, and that explains actually a lot of adolescent behavior, right? So like subcortical areas that are linked with emotion might mature ahead of prefrontal areas that are associated with regulation and self-control. And the adolescent brain is changing in ways that serve evolutionarily salient goals, like individuating from the family of origin, forming new connections, which involves taking risks, experimenting, seeking out new learning opportunities, right? So all of that tracks with that subcortical remodeling. So the transition to parenthood has received less study. I am actually getting on a plane tomorrow to go to the Parental Brain Conference in Barcelona. It's, I think, the fourth conference that Parental Brain has had. And, really, I think one of the few sort of gatherings for this emerging field, which is really still in its first decade or so. But that work on humans has been and on animals has been finding the transition to parenthood is also a time of enhanced remodeling and change. And in the same way, the adolescent brain is changing in ways that serve the goals of adolescence, the parenting brain may be changing in ways that serve the goals of new parenthood, such as developing the ability to empathize with a vulnerable infant who cannot communicate well, or being rewarded by repeated interactions with an infant. All of these things are accompanied by changes to the structure and function of the brain. And there's evidence in new moms, which I'll tell you about in a minute, that the brain actually seems to shrink across the transition to parenthood, which sounds like a bit of a bad joke, but this is from a study published by Susana Carmona, who's also written this book, Neuromaternal, which has been published in Spanish and is coming out in English next year from MIT Press. Susana Carmona, along with her colleague Elseline Haxama, did a landmark study of mothers' brains in 2016, finding that when you compare preconception maternal brain scans to early postpartum scans, women lose gray matter cortical volume across the whole brain, and actually subcortical volume as well, in regions that are associated particularly with social and emotional processing, like social cognition, mentalizing networks regions. And so the researchers' working theory, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that this remodeling is adaptive. It's a pruning, a reorganization that makes the brain work more efficiently and facilitates kind of faster connections in social cognition regions, because being a parent requires so much mentalizing work. So even though we're losing volume, we're not necessarily losing function. And similarly, in early childhood, there's a lot of pruning that happens, and we think there might be sort of a process of pruning that's happening to the parenting brain as well. And that's kind of borne out by some of the studies. There have been now a couple of replications of this study, but finding that when women do lose more gray matter volume, they report stronger adjustment to parenthood and better bonding with their infants. So I was very curious to see if we could repeat this study in fathers. So I went to Spain and did my Fulbright with some of the people from that original research group, including Susanna Carbona. And we pooled our scans, scans that we'd acquired from our lab at USC with scans that they had acquired from partners of the mothers that they followed, and found that, in fact, there were longitudinal gray matter reductions in men's brains across the transition to parenthood, very similar to what had been found in mothers. But those changes were less striking and smaller in magnitude and more variable. And they were confined really just to the cortex, which is the kind of outer layer of tissue in the brain that is linked with our higher order kind of thinking and reasoning functions. Whereas the subcortex is more sort of our emotion, reward, and sort of like species survival dependent set of brain regions. So cortex and subcortex seem to be remodeled in mothers. We only found cortical change in our fathers. And then I can certainly answer more questions about this, but in the interest of time, we found volume loss across lots of different networks in the brain, but particularly as in mothers, mentalizing network regions. So I subsequently followed up on this joint study with a couple of additional studies in my lab looking only at the fathers in our USC sample. So within our fathers, we found that when dads showed greater gray matter volume loss from prenatal to postpartum, consistent with the mothering brain literature, those fathers who lost more gray matter volume reported stronger postpartum bonding with the infant. They were more motivated during pregnancy to take time off to care for the infant. They reported stronger antenatal attachment, so even before the baby was born. They spent more time with their infants, and particularly they spent more time in primary caregiver roles. So it seemed like these gray matter volume reductions were adaptive in the sense that they were facilitating the father-infant relationship. However, fathers who lost more gray matter volume also reported worse sleep, sort of escalatingly worse sleep across 3, 6, and 12 months postpartum, and more mental health problems after birth, including depression, anxiety, and overall psychological symptoms. And that was after we controlled for prenatal mental health. So kind of similar to the testosterone results I showed you before, right? The testosterone might be changing in ways that serve the new parent relationship or that are beneficial to the family, but might have an individual cost for fathers. There seems to be a cost of caregiving for men, and that cost may mirror mothers' experiences, right? We know that many mothers who are, really attached to their infants also report more isolation, more distress, more fatigue. And so I think the bottom line here is not so much that no one should become a parent, but rather that we need to recognize that parenting is challenging and that parents need support to successfully navigate this multifaceted transition. We also did another study looking specifically at our USC fathers, focused on the hippocampus. So you heard me say that we didn't see overall kind of main effect subcortical change in our fathers, but I wanted to hone in on the hippocampal areas specifically because in the maternal brain work, the hippocampus was the one region that rebounded after birth. So all the regions lost volume, but the hippocampus actually showed kind of a curvilinear pattern of change where it regained volume after birth. And so basically everything we found with individual differences with the fathers and the hippocampus was kind of the opposite of what we found with the cortex, which was that when dads had more prenatal risk, including a history of family adversity and lower oxytocin levels, they had smaller increases in left hippocampal volume. And when dads had larger increases from prenatal to postpartum in the left hippocampus, they had a stronger drop in testosterone from before to after birth. They reported stronger bonding and attachment. They reported that they were more effective as parents, and they had lower parenting stress. So we think we were catching the hippocampus sort of on the rebound trajectory, such that regaining more volume was more adaptive for our dads. So you might be asking, there's all this stuff that might be happening in the first months after men become parents. What does that tell us about sort of long-term neurocognitive outcomes? And I cannot answer that question using data from our lab, but there is some evidence that parenthood might be neuroprotective, both for mothers and fathers. So there are some studies using data from UK Biobank, which is a really big, thousands of brains sample of older adults, finding that for both men and women, having had higher parity or having had more children is associated with younger looking brain age. So when you use a sort of brain age detection algorithm to gauge the age of the brain and then compare it to chronological age, essentially the brain looks younger when people have had more children. And I think the fact that we see this in fathers as well as mothers is really interesting, because it suggests that it's not just about pregnancy hormones or breastfeeding related hormones. It's not just about the reproductive transition per se. It's also about, I think, the social experience, the caregiving experience that we acquire when we are parents. And it may be that becoming a parent is a proxy for social integration or for being in a partnered couple or in a set of family relationships. We know isolation is risky for aging, especially for men. But in any case, I think this is encouraging news that even as the brain is losing volume in certain parts of the brain in early parenthood, there seems to be kind of some improvement to the overall sort of youthfulness of the brain later in life. So I'm going to touch on just a couple other studies from our lab that are using our brain data. This work is led by my postdoc, Anthony Vaccaro, who looked at our resting state connectivity. So essentially looking at what parts of the brain talk to each other when the brain isn't engaged in an external task. And finding that certain patterns of brain connectivity were associated with fathers' increases in meaning across the transition to parenthood, and that those were opposite to the patterns that we found to be associated with parenting stress. And I think understanding meaning is really important when we think about the transition to parenthood. I've just showed some results that the same factors that were linked with better bonding and attachment were also linked with mental health and sleep concerns. I think sort of finding meaning is one potential resilience booster, that even though parenthood is challenging kind of moment to moment, it can be taxing and tiring. It can give us a stronger sense of kind of identity, legacy, connection, and personal meaning. So kind of understanding how that's associated with brain remodeling, I think, is a really important direction for the field. Okay, so I'm going to start to wrap up with some take-home messages. I think sort of overall, dad brain is real. So we often think that, mothers have this kind of innate predisposition to care, that it's hardwired, that they are kind of equipped with a biology that's responsive to reproductive transition. But our lab is saying that some of those factors are true for men as well, and that we can detect changes to the brain, changes to hormones that track with parenting experiences. And we also find that individual differences really matter. So men's involvement in care, their motivation to care, their engagement with the child, their time spent parenting, all of those things are correlated with the extent to which we see neurobiological change. So, I like to say great dads are made, not born. It's not like we're all sort of born knowing how to be a good parent, but experience is really what shapes the parenting brain and also makes us, I think, capable of caring for children. As I said earlier, there's kind of a double-sided set of findings where the same brain changes that are linked with bonding and motivation to parent are also linked with some risks and a potential cost of caregiving. But, you know, those brain changes might also be linked with sort of later resilience. Some clinical specific take homes, I think, for those who are working with new fathers or new families, is that even though men are not undergoing an obvious physical transformation, you know, everybody knows when a woman is pregnant or she's had her baby because she looks physically different if she's a biological mother. We don't have that set of clues for men, but they're still undergoing change across multiple domains, from brain, hormones, relationship, identity, priorities, and their sense of meaning. And we know that fathers' involvement in parenting is beneficial for the whole family. So mothers report lower stress and less isolation when fathers are more involved. I didn't have time to share this study in this slideshow, but we have another paper from our lab finding that when dads can access paid paternity leave, mothers actually report lower stress and are buffered from depression across the transition to parenthood. So we know there are benefits to mom. We know that kids really benefit when fathers are involved. You know, kids do better when they have more time with fathers who are more interactive with them. And we also know that there are benefits to men themselves when they're involved in parenting and caregiving. And the time shortly after birth is a good opportunity to set the stage, help fathers to feel more confident and supported in their parenting. So I have just completed my first book. It's called Dad Brain, and it is about this research. But in the process of writing the book, I also talked to a lot of clinicians, physicians, pediatricians, and fathers themselves. And a lot of people really echoed this point that learning some skills and developing some confidence in the first few months after birth can really create opportunities for dads to feel more empowered and more connected with their kids. So I think thinking about this as a window for intervention, whether in pregnancy, helping couples communicate. I think Gabe's results that he shared about validation give us some really valuable insights about, you know, ways that we can facilitate better communication in couples transitioning to parenthood. But, you know, also helping individual mental health services for men and trying to prevent postpartum depression or perinatal mood disorders. So services tend to focus on mothers as the default, but having resources for fathers, including them in the process, even just, you know, making sure they're invited to well baby visits, can be really valuable. In terms of policy take homes, we know that paid paternity leave is kind of a luxury in the US. And we're really an outlier compared to other countries in terms of our provisioning of paid parental leave. So, you know, pretty much every other OECD nation, every industrialized country has a much more generous federally paid leave than we do. And there are a number of programs that have been tried in quite a few countries, including Spain, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, that give incentives or nudges to encourage fathers to take time off specifically after birth. There are use it or lose it programs where a certain number of months are earmarked specifically for fathers. If they don't take those months, then the couple loses them. Or, you know, programs that just give dad an extra incentive to take some more time. But it's not enough just to offer leave. We also need culture and workplace change. There's a lot of evidence, especially in the US, that even when paternity leave is available through the workplace, many dads feel like they face stigma or are reluctant to use the leave that's available to them. Our ideal worker sort of narratives really conflict with our understanding of what a good parent looks like. And so I think a lot of fathers and families are struggling with that. So I think this research is helpful because it lets us see fatherhood as transformative and dynamic. And this idea that when there's change, there's vulnerability, we want to shore up and provide support to people that are going through these kind of large scale transformations. Okay, so what are we doing in the lab now? I told you about some data that we collected around the transition to parenthood. We're bringing families back for a 7-year follow-up. So the kids who were in utero during their first visit to the lab are now coming back and they're able to engage in interactions with their families. We have a Magna-Tiles kind of block building task, which is depicted here. We also have some discussions to try to learn more about the child and the child's family life. And we're looking at mental health outcomes and couple dynamics at 7 years postpartum. And of course, we're scanning the father's brains again. And we're also scanning the kids' brains. And we were just in lab meeting yesterday, and my postdoc, Anthony, I told you about his resting state work, is now working on a really cool pipeline to look at father-child inter-subject synchrony to see whether their brains are showing similar responses to the same external stimulus. So we're going to be able to really look at father-child brain together. That's kind of where we're headed in the next few years. Okay, closing question. This is my critical window joke. Is the transition to parenthood a critical window for health in adulthood? I think it is. It's a change in neurobiology, our stress, our roles, our relationships, our sleep, our body weight, our mood disorders, our identities, our sense of self, meaning, and purpose. And changes in these processes can set or inflect health trajectories and health disparities that persist into midlife and beyond into late life. So thank you so much for listening to us and for inviting us to present to you. I want to thank our funders. I want to thank our amazing graduate students, including Gabe and members of the lab, and especially our participating families and their infants. And we're happy to take questions. I see a hand up. I see a couple hands up. Natalie?
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I was reminiscing a lot on some of my background in like parent-child and adolescent friendship work. And I was wondering, particularly with the work related to relationship quality and hormones, if y'all have looked at all at co-rumination and whether you'd anticipate that there would be some of those testosterone shifts with co-rumination, or if you may sometimes see the same trade-off where it's increasing the relationship quality, but also contributing to increases in internalizing symptomatology. Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. Gabe, I feel like that's up your alley if you want to take a stab.
Yeah, we haven't actually measured co-rumination directly, but I think it's something that could be potentially measured. As I mentioned, we used a coding scheme that identifies many different kinds of like interaction behaviors. And I've done a lot of the coding myself, and I've seen a lot of the videos, and we do see a lot of the co-rumination happen, especially within one of our interaction paradigms where we ask folks their hopes, fears, and expectations for parenthood. And then we also do a follow-up at 6 months postpartum to see kind of like, does it match their reality? And I'm actually trying to put together a coding system for that kind of looks more at like meaning and like kind of how what is your like mindset or attitude towards the challenges of parenting. But I think co-rumination would fit in right there. I don't know, I can't speculate like how that would affect hormones, but very interesting question there.
Yeah, definitely something we could look at. Yeah, Marquette?
Hi, thank you both so much for the presentation. I have to admit it was sounding familiar, and I realized it's because I listened to you on Mommy Brain Revisited, kind of addressing
Right.
this exact information. So I'm one of the reproductive psychiatrists here at the University of New Mexico. And hearing you talk about, the impact on mental health, that this increase in drive we see in, men participating significantly in child caregiving, especially in those early days. We, prescribe sleep as much as possible as reproductive psychiatrists. And so it makes me wonder how large of a role that sleep deprivation plays on the non-birthing parent, who's likely driven more so to participate in the nighttime caregiving, like feeds and changes with that reduction in gray brain matter. So curious if you can speak to that, and maybe I missed it in your presentation.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'm glad you mentioned the Mommy Brain Revisited podcast, because as I said, I'm going to this parental brain conference tomorrow. And Jody Paluski, who's the host of Mommy Brain Revisited, is one of the organizers. So I'm going to get to see her. So thinking about sleep, I think sleep is kind of the $1 million question when it comes to the transition to parenthood literature, because We don't have great ways to measure it. We know it's important. And we know it's one of those things that really changes when you become a parent. So I talked about it very briefly with the cortical gray matter volume loss, that men who lost more gray matter had worse sleep quality. What was really interesting about that was it wasn't that they had worse prenatal sleep that predicted losing more gray matter. It was that when they lost gray matter, they had worse sleep following the scan. So it was almost like the gray matter loss came before the sleep problems, although we measured sleep at 3, 6, and 12 months. So and the scan was about 6 to 12 months postpartum. So it was sort of like both cross-sectional and longitudinal, like so a little hard to tease out the causality there. And there was also some variability because of the pandemic. But I think sleep is one of those things. We know it's really associated with mood disorders. And we also know that, because the norm in the US is for couples to share a bed, men are woken up, even if mom is breastfeeding and doing a lot of the nighttime parenting, dads are along for the ride, right? They may not wake up as thoroughly as mom does. Um, the couple might have an arrangement where dad does a nighttime bottle, right? So there's a lot of variability, I think, in how much sleep is disturbed. And for my book, I talked to hunter-gatherer researchers, like anthropologists that study different kinds of cultures. There's a lot of nighttime co-sleeping with baby and parenting that happens where, like, mom and baby might be in bed together and father's in a different room. So it's like we think of the sort of like normal sleep arrangement is like mom and dad in bed, baby's in a crib, right? But actually the normal sleep arrangement is kind of unusual in a lot of other parts of the world. So nighttime parenting is one of those things that I think we need to measure more to understand what involvement at night looks like and how that differs from hands-on involvement during the day. And one anthropologist I spoke to said something really interesting, which was there are a lot of traditional cultures where everybody wakes up at night with the baby because they're in a small room and everyone's co-sleeping, but fathers are hands off during the day. So it's like they might actually be doing more kind of nighttime parenting and less daytime parenting, whereas in the industrialized world, fathers might be doing more daytime parenting and less nighttime parenting. Anyway, don't have good answers to any of your questions. I just think it's all super interesting to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, I just had a question regarding, due to like sort of the socioeconomic sort of issues we frequently deal with, we see a lot more grandparents actually raising children. And I was kind of curious if there's any research about how some of what you're seeing in parents is sort of potentially, if you're seeing similar findings or not in grandparents who are primarily involved in raising children.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there is a study about that. The lead author is James Rilling, who's at Emory. I'm on a panel with him next week as part of this conference. He studied brain changes in grandparents. And he found that basically grandmother brains look a lot like mom brains. So you see similar responses to the kid, similar structural change. And I'm trying to remember, he also looked at like there was another sample that was of older adults who were caregiving for a partner with Alzheimer's. And so he was sort of looking at the caregiving brain, both like for grandparents who were sort of primary caregivers of young kids and also older adults who were caregivers of other adults. And I think he found that the older adult caregiving of another adult was more stressful than the grandparenting. But there were some different results in terms of the brain. So if you're curious, I think the lead author is Rilling, and I think the title is like grandmother brain or grandparent brain, something like that. And it's out in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Journal, which is called SCAN.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So are you all mostly physicians, mostly psychologists, mostly students, or what's the sort of profile of most of the people here? I'm curious.
Yeah, so in our department, we have a mix of psychiatrists and several psychiatrists who have subspecialty training. We have some folks here from our VA hospital as well as UNM, and then we also have psychologists, and as well as subspecialized psychologists. And then we have some of our fellows here from our training programs, but actually all of our residents are off at a retreat today. So
Oh yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah.
so otherwise just I think maybe a few of our students as well.
Yeah. Great.
Well,
Can I
okay.
ask another question before you go? Have you heard the term, I'm sure you have, matrescence?
Yes.
Do you know if there's an analogous one for fatherhood or if that
Yeah. I mean, there's one that I use, petrescence.
makes sense? Okay.
But that's just I don't know if that's like a real term or if that's just something that I say.
Well, matrescence wasn't a real term for a while, so.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the woman who wrote the book Matrescence, I'm trying to remember her name, but I think it's such a useful concept, right? That like we're, in the same way that we have like adolescence, it's like this distinct stage. And I think that helps the public understand, I think, more about just like what's dynamic if we sort of have a special word for it that really honors this transitional window.
Yeah, it's Lucy Jones. I just quickly Googled the
Oh,
term
thank you.
myself.
Yes. Yeah, she's done a lot of really good writing about motherhood and the mind science.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both again so much for your time and for this beautiful presentation today. We will make sure to distribute some of the information to everyone here and hope that you all can stay in contact as it might be of interest. So yes, thank you for your time this Friday. Hope you have a great weekend ahead.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you. All right, everyone, take care. We'll see you soon.